Duke finds little girl and her dog sleeping on trash. The truth broke his heart. The autumn of 1878 arrived in Wiltshire with an unusual cruelty. It was not the slow, amber departure that poets imagined when they wrote of the English countryside in October. It was sharp and grey, a season that seemed to have skipped its own beauty entirely, moving without ceremony from the last warmth of summer into something cold and indifferent. The fields around Ashford Manor turned from gold to the colour of old pewter almost overnight, and the mist that gathered each evening across the low meadows refused to lift until well past midday. By nightfall, the air carried a bite that discouraged even the hardiest of souls from lingering outdoors. It was into precisely this kind of evening that William Ashford, the 8th Duke of Ashford, ventured alone. He was not a man given to sentimentality about nature, nor did he often walk the outer boundaries of his estate without purpose. He was, by most accounts, a man of considered action, deliberate in speech, measured in expression, and deeply private in the way that men of great title and greater grief often become. Those who served him at the manor understood that his solitary walks were not invitations to conversation. They were, in their quiet way, the only hours in which he permitted himself to feel the full weight of what his life had become since his wife's death 4 years prior. The estate remained immaculate, his affairs perfectly ordered, his social obligations attended to with the correctness his position required. But the rooms of Ashford Manor had long grown silent, and William Ashford had learned to live inside that silence as though it were a second home. On that particular evening, he had walked further than usual. The path he followed skirted the eastern edge of his property, where the formal grounds gave way to rougher land, an area the estate workers used intermittently for storage and refuse disposal, far enough from the house to be invisible from its windows, close enough to the old stone boundary wall to be forgotten by most. It was not a place the Duke visited often. It held no particular appeal. There was nothing beautiful about it. He heard the dog first, a low, unsteady sound, somewhere between a whimper and an exhale, coming from a mound of discarded sacking and broken wooden crates that had been stacked near the wall. He stopped walking. The wind shifted, and the sound came again. Not the sound of an animal in immediate pain, but of one that had been cold and still for too long, maintaining its vigil over something it refused to abandon. William Ashford was not a man easily moved to sudden impulse. He stood for a moment listening, before he stepped off the path and moved toward the pile. His lantern cast a pale oval of light across the ground, revealing the frost already beginning to form on the fallen leaves. And then the light found them. She was very small. That was the first thing. The smallness of her, curled so tightly into herself that she might have been mistaken for a bundle of discarded cloth. She was perhaps 5 years of age or thereabouts, dressed in a woolen coat several sizes too large, the sleeves folded back to free her hands, a pair of worn leather shoes on her feet that had seen too many miles and too little care. Her dark hair was loose and tangled, spread across the sacking beneath her cheek. She was asleep, or something close to sleep. The uneasy, exhausted stillness of a child, who has cried herself beyond consciousness. Pressed against her, its large rough-coated body curved like a parenthesis around the child's back and legs, was a dog of indeterminate breed. Broad-shouldered, with the amber eyes of something part shepherd, part something older and harder to name. It was the dog that had made the sound. It had raised its great head at the Duke's approach and fixed him with a gaze of absolute steadiness, not threatening, but measuring, deciding in its animal wisdom whether this man who carried a light and walked quietly through the cold was worth waking the child over. William Ashford stood very still and let the dog look at him. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the Duke crouched down slowly, setting his lantern on the ground, and extended one hand with the patience of a man who had learned that trust in any creature could not be rushed. The dog regarded him, lowered its chin, did not growl. It took William only moments to understand the situation in its bare, unbearable simplicity. The child had no one. She had found the warmest available shelter, which was no shelter at all, and the dog had wrapped itself around her to share what little heat it possessed. They had been there long enough for the frost to begin settling on the outer layer of the child's coat. If the temperature continued to drop through the night, which he knew it would, the cold would move inward. He did not deliberate. He removed his own coat and draped it around the child without waking her, then lifted her, carefully, with the unhurried steadiness of a man who understood that abrupt movement would frighten her, and rose to his full height. She stirred but did not wake. Her head fell against his shoulder with the unconscious trust of a child who, in her deep exhaustion, registered only warmth and was satisfied. The dog rose too, and without hesitation fell into step beside him. William Ashford carried the child back across the cold field, through the gate in the ornamental wall, and up through the formal garden toward the lit windows of the house, with the dog at his heel and the mist thickening around them both. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brent, a woman of 60 years, and an immovable practicality that had served 3 generations of Ashfords, did not ask unnecessary questions when her employer entered through the back passage carrying a sleeping child and followed by a large muddy dog. She had learned over many years of service that questions could wait and warmth could not. She directed the housemaid to prepare a room, instructed the kitchen to produce hot broth, and arranged a blanket near the fire for the dog, which accepted this offering with quiet dignity and lay down without being told twice. The child slept through the night. William Ashford did not sleep much at all. He sat in the library with a glass of brandy he barely touched, and turned over the question of the child's origins with the same methodical attention he gave to all problems he could not immediately solve. She had not appeared from nothing. There was a coat that did not belong to her, shoes that had been resoled at least twice, and around her neck on a thin cord of leather, a small oval locket of the sort sold in modest jewellers' shops in market towns across England. He had not opened it. It was not his right. She woke in the morning with a stillness that struck him as unusual in a child her age. Most children, he understood, woke noisily and immediately. This one opened her eyes, regarded the unfamiliar ceiling of the guest room, with a calm that was somehow more unsettling than tears would have been, and then turned her head to find the dog, which had apparently migrated from downstairs during the night and installed itself at the foot of the bed. Having confirmed the dog's presence, she relaxed. Only then did she notice the Duke, who stood in the doorway with a cup of warm milk he had no idea how to offer. Her name, he learned through patient conversation over the course of that morning, was Emily. She was 4 years old, younger than he had guessed, and she offered information about herself in the cautious, selective way of a child who had been taught, perhaps not formally, but by experience, that not everything need be said to everyone. She knew her mother's name. She said it only once, as though it were a private thing. And when she said it, something shifted in the quality of her expression. Not grief, exactly, but the awareness of absence. The awareness that something beloved was not where it should be. William sent riders to the nearest village and to the market town of Marlborough before noon. He sent inquiries to the parish records office and to the local magistrate. He was thorough. He was also aware, in the privacy of his own thinking, that he was somehow hoping the answers would take longer than they should to arrive. Emily spent the day in the library, which she navigated with her dog at her side, and her small hands folded behind her back in a posture that was, without her knowing it, a precise imitation of something she had seen in someone she loved. She examined the spines of books she could not yet read, stood at the window to study the garden with the focused attention of a naturalist, and accepted the offerings of the kitchen. Warm bread, soup, a small apple tart, with a gravity of gratitude that was entirely too old for her face. She did not ask where her mother was. She did not cry. She waited, in the way that children wait, when they have learned that adults will tell them what they need to know when they are ready to tell it, and not a moment before. The Duke watched her more than he intended to. The answers came on the second day. They came in pieces, from 3 separate sources, and when William assembled them in the correct order, they formed a picture that was both clearer and more complicated than he had hoped. The child's mother was known in the village of Alderton, 3 miles from the estate's eastern boundary. She had taken lodgings there 4 months ago, arriving alone with the child and the dog, presenting herself quietly and paying her rent on time. She had given her name as Miss Eleanor Whitmore, and had secured employment immediately as a seamstress for the local draper, a position well beneath what her manner and her accent suggested she had previously held. She had been unremarkable in the village in all respects except one. People noticed her the way they noticed a thing that did not quite fit its frame. The second piece of information came from Marlborough. A correspondent there, an acquaintance of the Duke's solicitor, recognized the name without hesitation. Eleanor Whitmore had, until the spring of 1875, been governess to the children of Sir Nathaniel Voss, a man of considerable standing in Berkshire society. The arrangement had ended abruptly, and without the kind of reference letter that would have allowed her to seek a comparable position elsewhere. The circumstances of her departure were not documented in any official record, but the correspondent made clear, with the careful vagueness of a man conveying more than he wished to write down, that a scandal had attached itself to her name. One of those particularly efficient and devastating rumours that required no evidence to sustain itself and gathered credibility simply by being repeated. The third piece arrived last, and it was the piece that required the least explanation and carried the most weight. Emily had been found not accidentally on the Duke's land, but practically at the border of it, because Eleanor Whitmore had walked 3 miles from Alderton on the night in question, having lost her lodgings that afternoon. The draper had released her from her position that same morning, not for any failure of work, but because a customer of his, a woman of local importance, had learned of Eleanor's history and made her continued custom contingent on Eleanor's removal. Eleanor had gathered what little she could carry, paid what she owed on her room, and had nowhere left to go. She had walked east because east was the direction she associated with employment, or the possibility of it. She had walked until the child could not walk further, and then she had made Emily as warm as she could and gone to find help, leaving the dog as the child's guardian. She had not returned by morning because she had not found help in time to return. She had been taken in by a farm worker's wife in a hamlet on the far side of the ridge, too ill by the time she arrived from exposure and exhaustion to be moved. She was recovering. She did not yet know where her daughter was. William Ashford read these assembled facts with the careful attention he gave to everything, and then he set them down and looked out the window at the garden for a long time. He sent his own carriage to the hamlet to bring Eleanor Whitmore to Ashford Manor. She arrived in the late afternoon of the second day, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, pale with the particular pallor of someone who has been very cold and has not yet fully recovered the colour that warmth should restore. She was perhaps 28 years old. He noted this without particular intention, in the detached observational way he catalogued most things, and she carried herself with a precision that suggested posture had been, at some earlier point in her life, a matter she had been required to maintain regardless of circumstance. Her dark hair was drawn back simply. Her eyes, when she looked at him in the entrance hall of Ashford Manor, were a shade of grey that was neither warm nor cold, but watchful. The eyes of a person who has learned to assess a room and its occupants before deciding what to offer of themselves. When Emily appeared from the library doorway, drawn by some instinct that adults lack, some interior notification system that exists only in very young children, and crossed the hall at a controlled run that stopped just short of her mother's legs, Eleanor Whitmore held the child with the intensity of a person who had spent 40 hours not knowing if that holding would ever be possible again. She held her for a long time. She did not look at the Duke while she held her. She did not need to. William had prepared himself in those 40 hours for various versions of this meeting. He had prepared for fear, for evasion, for the practiced gratitude of a woman who understood she was entirely dependent on the goodwill of a powerful man. He had prepared for the performance that desperation sometimes requires. What he had not prepared for was what Eleanor Whitmore actually offered when she finally released her daughter and looked at him directly. A clarity so complete and so unguarded that it briefly undid his composure. She thanked him, not with the elaborate formalities that his rank might have expected, but simply as one person thanks another for a thing that cannot really be repaid, acknowledging the impossibility without trying to soften it. She was not performing. He recognized the difference. He had encountered enough performance in drawing rooms and dining halls to understand immediately when he was not seeing it. She was simply a woman looking at a man who had kept her child warm. And she was grateful in the way that people are grateful for things that matter most. He offered her rooms for the night, and when she began to refuse, as he knew she would, he offered the reasoning she could not decline. She was still unwell, the child was settled, the evening was cold, and there was nowhere at present for her to go. He said these things without emphasis and without condescension, stating facts rather than constructing an argument. And she heard the facts and accepted them, as a person of intelligence accepts what is simply true. He did not join her for dinner. He thought it wiser, for reasons he did not examine too closely, to give her the evening undisturbed. He ate alone in the dining room, as he always did, with the long table and the long silence, and the portraits of his ancestors arranged along the walls in their characteristic expressions of composed authority. And he thought about a woman with grey eyes, who held her child as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had become mostly water. Mrs. Brent, who had navigated the domestic architecture of Ashford Manor for 2 decades and understood its currents better than anyone, said nothing at all. She said it with the eloquent silence of a woman who has observed enough of human nature to know when observation is sufficient. Eleanor Whitmore remained at Ashford Manor for 3 days, and then she remained for 3 more. And then the question of her departure became, by degrees, less urgent than the question of what she might do that would be useful. It was Mrs. Brent who raised the matter practically, as Mrs. Brent raised all practical matters, and who suggested, in the direct, unapologetic way that made her indispensable, that the Manor's correspondence and household accounts had been managed by the late Duchess, and had since fallen to a system that pleased no one, and that Miss Whitmore, who had demonstrated a thorough and precise hand, might be of use in an organizational capacity if she were willing. It was not a governess position. It was not quite a secretary's position either. It existed somewhere in the difficult middle ground that the English household of that era had not developed sufficient vocabulary to name, which suited Eleanor Whitmore and William Ashford equally, since both of them seemed to prefer arrangements that existed in spaces language had not fully claimed. She organized the household correspondence with a speed and accuracy that revealed immediately how much education she had received, and how little of it had ever been put to its full use. She had a mind for systems and for the particular clarity that emerges when accumulated disorder is finally sorted into sense. She did not speak unnecessarily. She did not impose herself on the Duke's days in any form that required acknowledgement. She moved through Ashford Manor like someone who understood that presence could be either burdensome or neutral, and who had chosen with great deliberateness to be neutral. William Ashford noticed, as a consequence, everything she did, He noticed the way she sat in the small writing room off the east corridor, her back to the window, so the light fell across the papers she worked over. He noticed that she and Emily had developed a system of quiet understanding, the dog serving as intermediary, Emily conducting her daily investigations of the house with a freedom she had perhaps never had before, always within some invisible radius of her mother's location. He noticed that Eleanor read to Emily each evening before bed, not from the simplified picture books he had requested Mrs. Brent source from the village, but from actual literature, poetry, natural history, passages from novels, trusting the child to receive what she could and release the rest, as all good readers do. He noticed that she wore always around her neck the same locket he had seen on Emily when he carried the child in from the cold, and that she touched it sometimes when she did not know she was being observed, her fingers finding it with the automatic precision of a gesture repeated so many times it had become the body's own. He did not ask about the locket. He did not ask about Sir Nathaniel Voss. He did not ask about the scandal or the lost reference or the accumulated disasters that had brought a woman of obvious intelligence and evident capability to sleep near a refuse pile in October with nothing between her child and the cold but a borrowed coat and a dog's devotion. He did not ask because he had decided, in the private machinery of his own reasoning, that these were questions Eleanor Whitmore would answer if she chose to, and in the order she chose, and that any other approach was something he was not willing to be. It was the dog who first moved the distance between them, as dogs have a gift for doing, indifferent to the careful distances that people arrange around themselves. The animal had, in the manner of large, confident dogs everywhere, identified William Ashford as a person of significance, and had begun, quietly and without making a production of it, to distribute his company between his primary loyalty and this secondary one. He would lie near Eleanor while she worked, and then make his slow, deliberate way to wherever the Duke happened to be reading or reviewing correspondence, and install himself there for an hour, and then return. He conducted this circulation without apparent agenda, a free agent of warmth, dispensing his presence like a form of assessment that required no words. William Ashford, who had not had a dog in the house since his wife's spaniel had died the winter after its mistress, found that he did not mind. He found if he were honest, and he was a man who valued honesty even when it arrived at inconvenient conclusions, that he minded very little about the current occupancy of Ashford Manor, and that this surprised him. The first frost of genuine winter arrived in the second week of November, and covered the grounds in a white so clean and uniform that it seemed to reset the landscape entirely, returning everything to some original simplicity. Emily saw it from the window before anyone else, and stood with her small palms pressed flat against the glass, in an attitude of astonishment so complete that it seemed briefly to illuminate the room from within. William Ashford, passing the corridor on his way to the east wing, paused in the doorway and watched her watching the frost, and felt something in the architecture of his chest rearrange itself by a fraction. Eleanor was at the writing table behind her daughter, her eyes lifted from the ledger she had been reviewing. She was watching the same thing the Duke was watching, the child at the window, the frost, the undisguised joy of a small person encountering beauty. And she was watching it with the expression of a person who has learned to hold happiness carefully, the way you hold something that has been broken before and might break again. She did not know the Duke was in the doorway. He was certain of this. He watched her for 10 seconds. He counted them later, in his memory, with the odd precision of a man cataloguing something he knows will matter. And then he moved on without announcing himself. He thought about that expression for the rest of the day. It was Mrs. Brent who told him the rest of it one evening in early December, with the directness that had always made her both invaluable and, on occasion, uncomfortable. She told him not as gossip. She was not a woman of gossip, but as information she had gathered over weeks of observation and had determined he needed. The scandal involving Eleanor Whitmore and the household of Sir Nathaniel Voss had not been of Eleanor's making. It had been made by Sir Nathaniel himself, who had found in Eleanor's position of dependence a convenience he had attempted to exploit. And when she had refused him, he had destroyed her reputation as efficiently as a man of his standing could, which was to say, completely. He had told his wife a story that positioned Eleanor as the aggressor. He had told his friends a related version. The household staff, who had witnessed rather more of the truth, were employed by Sir Nathaniel and understood the cost of contradiction. Eleanor Whitmore had departed without a reference, without recourse, and without the energy to fight a narrative that had been constructed expressly to outrun any response she could mount. The child, Emily, had been born to Eleanor 2 years before the governess position, from a prior attachment that had also ended in loss, not through scandal but through death. The child's father, a young teacher in Oxfordshire, who had died of fever before he and Eleanor could formalize what had been between them. She had managed for several years to maintain a life that was quiet and decent and sufficient. Sir Nathaniel Voss had ended that. William Ashford listened to this in his chair by the fire, with the measured stillness he brought to most things, and did not speak until Mrs. Brent had finished. Then he thanked her, as he always thanked her, concisely, genuinely, and she left, and he sat alone with the fire and the brandy and the information that had just rearranged several of his assumptions, and thought about duty and justice and the peculiar weight of knowing something you cannot unknow. He did not change his behaviour toward Eleanor Whitmore in any obvious way the following morning. He was too careful a man for obvious things, but there was, perhaps, a small shift in the quality of his attention, an attention that had, until now, been the attention of a man watching something he does not yet understand, and became, on that December morning, the attention of a man watching something he understands too well and is not yet certain what to do with the understanding. December deepened. The house took on the particular atmosphere of a place preparing for a season it had forgotten how to celebrate. Mrs. Brent, interpreting the general improvement in domestic energy as implicit permission, began organizing for Christmas with the contained enthusiasm of a woman who has been waiting years for an occasion. Greenery appeared along the stair rails. A fire was lit in the morning room for the first time in 4 years. Emily, who had the instincts of a child who had spent too long in cramped borrowed rooms, expanded into the space of Ashford Manor as though she had always been intended for it, conducting expeditions through rooms with the dog at her heels, and returning to the writing room each evening to present her mother with some object she had discovered. A brass paperweight in the shape of a tortoise, a letter opener with an ivory handle, a small painting of a horse that she had decided, with absolute conviction, was named William. William Ashford learned of the horse's name through Mrs. Brent, and allowed himself a smile in private that he would not have permitted in public for any amount of social pressure. He and Eleanor began, by degrees, to occupy the same rooms at the same times without the careful avoidance that had characterized the first weeks. This happened gradually, in the way that all real shifts in human proximity happen, not by decision, but by the slow accumulation of unremarkable moments that add up, eventually, to something that cannot be easily undone. An evening in which he worked at the library desk while she organized a shelf of correspondence nearby. A morning in which they both stood at the same window, watching Emily conduct an important investigation of the frost-covered herb garden with the dog. A shared walk along the upper corridor when they happened to be moving in the same direction, and neither could reasonably veer off without making it strange. They talked about small things, the management of the estate, the organization of a set of documents she had found misfiled and wished to address, a bird she had seen from the east window that she could not identify, the dog's apparent passion for the cook's scones. They talked about small things, because neither of them had yet found the language for the large things, and because in the space between the small things, if one listened carefully, much of the large things was already present. In the pause before an answer, in the particular care with which sentences were finished or not finished, in the way that eyes sometimes rested somewhere other than where they should before being recalled, Christmas arrived with snow, which was not common in that part of Wiltshire, and which Emily greeted with a solemnity of joy that struck the household as deeply moving. There was a dinner, and there were gifts that Mrs. Brent had organized with a thoroughness that impressed everyone and surprised no one who knew her. Emily received a doll of excellent manufacture and a picture book of English birds, and she accepted both with the gravity of a child conducting an official ceremony. The dog received a beef bone of considerable size, and retired with it to the corner with the focused satisfaction of a creature whose requirements were simple and well understood. William Ashford gave Eleanor Whitmore a book, a collected volume of essays on natural history, which he had selected with more deliberation than anyone was in a position to know about, because she had mentioned once, in passing, almost as an aside, that she had loved natural history as a girl, and had always wished she had pursued it further. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. She held it for a moment in both hands before she looked up, and in the interval between receiving the book and looking up, something shifted in her expression that William Ashford saw and did not comment on, because he was a man who understood that some things are better held in silence than pursued into language before their time. The new year came cold and clear. January spread across the Wiltshire countryside with the clean indifference of a blank page, and with it came several things that required decision. A letter arrived from London, from the offices of William's solicitor, regarding a matter of estate business that would require his presence in the city for 2 weeks in February. A second letter arrived, unrequested and therefore more pointed, from a Lady Hartwell of his acquaintance, a woman of the particular social breed that interprets long-established proximity to the aristocracy as a form of deputized authority, noting, with the careful indirection of the practiced gossip, that she had heard unusual domestic arrangements had taken hold at Ashford Manor, and that she would be delighted to hear that everything was conducted with appropriate propriety. William read this letter twice. Then he folded it with the neat, minimal movements of a man containing a very specific irritation, and set it in the drawer where he kept things he intended to respond to when he had achieved the distance necessary for a response that did not betray his actual feelings. The third thing that January brought was simpler in form and more complicated in effect. He encountered Eleanor on the rear terrace one morning, earlier than either of them was usually about, both having apparently arrived at the same solution to the same sleeplessness through separate roads. The air was very cold and perfectly still, and the grounds lay under a thin skin of ice that caught the early light and returned it in fractured pieces. They stood perhaps 6 feet apart and watched the morning arrive, and neither of them spoke for a time that lasted long enough to become its own kind of conversation. When she did speak, she spoke about the scandal, not in the way he might have anticipated, not with the practiced framing of a person constructing a defense, but simply the way a person speaks about something they have carried so long that the weight of not speaking about it has finally exceeded the weight of the thing itself. She told him what had happened at the Voss house. She told him what she had refused and what that refusal had cost her. She told him about the years since, about the decisions she had made for Emily and the ones she had been unable to make, about the precise calibration of hope and practicality that constituted a life in which all the conventional safety nets had been cut. She did not ask for his response. She did not shape her account toward any particular effect. She told him the truth, plainly, as one person tells another the truth when they have decided that the truth is the only thing left worth offering. He listened the way he listened to all things of importance, completely, without interruption, giving her the full attention of a man who understood that the act of listening was itself a form of response. When she finished, the morning had grown lighter. The fractured ice on the grounds had begun to shift from silver to pale gold. A single bird was conducting an inquiry into the hedge at the far end of the garden. He told her then that he already knew. He told her how he knew, and that Mrs. Brent had offered the information from care, not curiosity. He told her that what she had been told about herself, by people who needed a certain version of events to protect their own standing, bore no relationship to what he had observed over the preceding months, and that he was a man who trusted his own observation above most other forms of evidence. He did not say anything further than that. It was enough. He could see, in the alteration of her posture, in the slight softening at the corners of her mouth, in the way she exhaled, a long, controlled release, like a sentence that has been held in the lungs for too many years, that it was exactly enough. They walked back into the house separately, as they had come, but the 6 feet between them felt different from what it had felt like before. February arrived, and with it the necessity of London. William Ashford organised his departure with the efficiency that characterised his management of everything he did not particularly wish to do. And the morning he left, he found Emily in the library with her natural history book and her dog, conducting what appeared to be a formal lesson in which the dog was a reluctant but tolerant student. He told her he would return in a fortnight, and she received this information with the calm of a child who had learned to take departures seriously, and offered him her hand with a solemnity that he accepted in kind. He shook it once, formally, and she appeared satisfied with this agreement. He said farewell to Eleanor in the corridor outside the writing room. He had intended it to be brief. It was not particularly brief. There was a conversation about the correspondence she would manage in his absence, and then a conversation about a book he thought she might find useful. And then a silence in which neither of them said anything that they were, in that moment, most urgently thinking. Because some things require more time than a corridor, farewell allows. He thought about that silence throughout the journey to London, and at several points during the 2 weeks he spent there, which were productive and interminable in equal measure. London presented him, as it always did, with the concentrated version of the world he mostly preferred to observe from a comfortable distance. He attended the meetings his solicitor required. He dined with 2 old friends and endured 3 social engagements that protocol made unavoidable. At each of these engagements he encountered some variant of Lady Hartwell, the alert, well-positioned observer who had heard things about Ashford Manor and wished to hear more, framed as concern, delivered as appetite. He managed these conversations with the smooth deflection of a man who has been navigating social inference since the age of 12, offering nothing while appearing to offer everything, and returned to his London rooms each evening with the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent the day being several degrees less than themselves. One evening toward the end of the fortnight, he sat in his London study with a letter half-written, and acknowledged privately and without dramatic ceremony something he had been circling for weeks without yet landing on directly. He was, in the most disruptive and inconvenient possible way, in love with Eleanor Whitmore. He recognized this not because it arrived with particular fanfare, but because the absence of it for 2 weeks had produced in him a clarity that proximity had complicated. He missed her mind. He missed the sound of her in the house, the particular quality of occupied silence she brought to rooms. He missed the way she touched the locket when she thought no one was watching. He missed, if he were being fully honest, everything about the domestic arrangement at Ashford Manor that had not existed 4 months ago, and that he now understood he did not wish to be without. He sat with this recognition for a long time. Then he finished the letter. which was to his solicitor and contained nothing of emotional significance whatsoever, and went to bed. And in the morning he arranged to return to Wiltshire a day earlier than planned. The countryside came back to him through the carriage window in the familiar sequence. The outskirts of towns giving way to longer roads, the roads becoming narrower and more particular, the sky opening as the buildings thinned, the first familiar landmark, and then the turning that led toward Ashford Manor, and then the house itself, grey and solid and lit with a warmth that he understood with some surprise was not simply the lamps, but something about what the lamps now indicated. Eleanor was in the library when he arrived, which was not where he had expected her to be at that hour. The writing room was her preferred space. She was standing at one of the shelves with a book open in her hands, and when he appeared in the doorway, she looked up with the involuntary, unguarded expression of someone who has not yet had time to compose a greeting. And in that fraction of a second before composure arrived, he saw plainly what she did not say, which was everything he needed to know. Emily arrived 3 minutes later from wherever she had been conducting her investigations, assessed the situation with the accuracy that small children and animals apply to the emotional states of the adults around them, and installed herself on the hearthrug with her dog in a posture of pleased contentment that required no explanation. William Ashford stood in the library of his house and understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a long detour through everything that seemed to argue against a thing, that the life he had been maintaining, orderly, correct, silent, was not insufficient because it had been wrong, but because it had been incomplete. He did not speak of this to Eleanor that evening. He was a patient man, and some things require the correct occasion rather than the nearest one. But over the following weeks, as March came in with the first tentative green at the margins of the fields, and Emily informed anyone who would listen that William, the horse in the painting, looked much happier now. The distance between the careful formality of what was and the honest simplicity of what was becoming grew smaller by degrees, in the way that real things grow, not all at once and not by announcement, but steadily in the direction of what they are meant to be. The morning he told her, finally in words, after so many months of everything else, it was raining. The spring rain of Wiltshire, which is soft and without apology, which does not perform but simply falls, filling the air with the smell of earth returning to life. They were standing in the garden, which was a thing neither of them could entirely explain in retrospect, since the rain had only just begun when they came to be standing in it, and retreating indoors had been, without either of them saying so, simply not something that occurred to them. He told her that he wished to know if there was any possibility that she might consider. And here he paused, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed a sentence many times and has just discovered that the rehearsed version is insufficient, that she might consider remaining at Ashford Manor not as a person in his employ, but as a person in his life. He said it plainly, not elegantly. He was an intelligent man who had, in this particular moment, lost access to his elegance entirely, and he thought she deserved the plain version more than the polished one. Eleanor Whitmore stood in the spring rain and looked at him. The locket was at her throat as always, and she touched it once, that familiar unconscious gesture, and then her hand stilled, and she looked at him with the grey eyes that had been measuring everything, from the first moment in the entrance hall, with a precision that he had learned to trust entirely. She told him that she had not come to Wiltshire looking for anything except survival. She told him that survival had turned out to be insufficient as an ambition, which she had discovered only after arriving somewhere, that offered more than survival without making it a performance. She told him that Emily, who had been in many rooms in her short life, had chosen this house to stop counting the doors, which Eleanor understood as the truest assessment of a place that any creature could offer. And she told him that she was not afraid of what people would say, because she had lived inside what people said for 3 years, and had learned that it was ultimately a sound that could be outlasted by anyone with sufficient reason to outlast it. She did not say everything, neither did he. There was an understanding between them, as there had been from the earliest days, that some things did not require the precision of language, that they lived in the register of silence and gesture, and the particular quality of being fully present with another person without requiring that presence to perform itself. The rain continued, unhurried and gentle, making the garden smell of possibility. The dog appeared from the house in the manner of a creature who has assessed the situation from a window and determined that his presence would improve it. Emily appeared 3 steps behind him, in the rubber boots Mrs. Brent had procured for her in February, and stood surveying the 2 adults in the garden with the expression of a person of 4 years, who has, through the exercise of patience and superior observation, arrived at a conclusion she finds entirely satisfactory. William Ashford looked at the child and the dog and the woman standing in the rain of his garden, and felt the silence of Ashford Manor, that long, echoing absence that had been the constant of his life for 4 years, shift and fill with something that was not loudness but was its opposite, the particular sound of a house that is at last inhabited by its true occupants. The formal engagement was arranged in the early weeks of April, with the correctness that William's position required and the brevity that his temperament preferred. The announcement was made in London, where it generated, as he had known it would, a season's worth of conversation in the drawing-rooms and dining-rooms that had spent the winter speculating about Ashford Manor. Lady Hartwell and her satellites exercised their opinions thoroughly, and finding that the Duke of Ashford declined to be diminished by opinion, gradually turned their attention elsewhere, as such circles always do when the object of their attention refuses to provide the response that sustains the pleasure of the exercise. There were those who would not receive Eleanor, and those who received her with the particular warmth that genuine people extended to a woman whose story, properly understood, reflected well on human perseverance. The former camp was smaller than anticipated, and the latter larger than feared, which is not always how things go in English society, but is sometimes how things go when the person at the centre of the question has sufficient dignity not to seek validation and sufficient intelligence to understand that the battle she is fighting is fought most effectively simply by continuing to live well. Emily, informed by her mother of the coming changes, with the honesty that had always characterized their communications, received the news with the equanimity of a child who had been making peace with impermanence for most of her remembered life, and who now, for the first time, was being asked instead to make peace with permanence. She required a day to consider this, and then appeared at the Duke's library with her hands behind her back, and told him, with the gravity of a small person delivering an important verdict, that she had decided the arrangement was satisfactory. She would, however, like it formalized that William, the horse in the painting, be moved to the upper landing, where the light was better. He agreed to this condition without reservation. The wedding took place in May, in the church at the edge of the village, in the simplest ceremony that dignity allowed and sentiment required. The countryside had come fully into its season by then, and the fields around Ashford Manor were the green that English fields achieve for only a few weeks each year, vivid and improbable, as though the landscape is briefly astonishing itself. The mist of October seemed very far away. The refuse pile at the edge of the eastern boundary had been cleared in March, the area planted with young trees at Emily's specific request, which Mrs. Brent had conveyed to the head groundsman without editorial comment. Eleanor Whitmore became Eleanor Ashford on a morning when the light came through the church windows in long, specific shafts, and the dog waited outside the gate with Emily, who had been escorted by Mrs. Brent in the capacity of a woman performing what amounted to parental honours, since those particular honours had been overdue for some time. What William Ashford had found on a cold October evening in the failing light at the edge of his own land was not only a child and her dog. He had found the specific form of courage that looks from the outside like nothing at all, that presents itself as a woman walking in the wrong direction through the cold towards some hope she cannot name, leaving her daughter in the care of the only guardian available, and continuing forward because forward is what she knows how to do. He had found a person who had been broken in the particular way that the world sometimes breaks good people, and who had not used the breaking as permission to become less than she was. He had found someone who had looked at the very worst of circumstances and maintained through all of it the steady, unperformable thing that is the core of a human being before the world has had its influence. And Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Ashford, standing in the church in the May light, in the simplest dress that was still a wedding dress, with her daughter watching from the front pew, with the dog's head in her lap, and the expression of a person present at the successful conclusion of a very long undertaking, understood that she had found something she had ceased to believe existed. A man whose authority expressed itself not as dominion, but as shelter, and whose silence was not the silence of indifference, but of the deepest kind of listening. A man who had read her story in its entirety, and had not used any part of it against her. A man who had seen Emily hold his hand in the formal, grave way of a child making a promise, and had understood, without being told, what was being asked of him, and had answered it by being exactly what he was. The carriage that carried them home through the Wiltshire lanes was loud with Emily's commentary on everything she observed through the window. And under this commentary, which required no response from either adult and generated the atmosphere of a life already fully in motion, William Ashford and Eleanor Ashford sat side by side with the particular ease of two people who have, through all the complicated roots of their respective histories, arrived at the only place either of them was ever going to feel entirely at home. The dogs slept across their feet. The lanes went on. The fields were very green. Ashford Manor stood as it had always stood, grey and solid and patient on the rise above the meadows, waiting in the way that houses wait for the people who will finally make them what houses are meant to be. And when the carriage turned at last through the iron gate and the house came into view, Emily pressed her face to the glass and then turned back to announce, with the absolute authority of a person of 4 years who had surveyed the situation and rendered her final judgment, that they were home. She was entirely right.